Hello everyone and welcome to RSK's latest panel in the Green Dialogue series. This week we'll be talking about can we rewild our inner cities? As the world's populations continue to expand rapidly into animal habitats, the question as to how and whether we even can live successfully side by side with wildlife becomes ever more pressing. Just something to flag before we get started, we have had a last minute speaker change and Elliot from the Beaver Trust will be joining us instead of his colleague Roshan. Unfortunately, he is having some technical issues with his camera, so unfortunately we won't be seeing him on screen, but please do still direct questions towards him for our end Q&A session. We highly encourage you to get involved in the conversation via social media. Please tag @RSK Group and use the hashtag #GreenDialogues. You can find us on Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook and Twitter just by searching RSK Group. And a couple of other housekeeping notes. All attendees' microphones are automatically muted throughout the webinar. During the presentation, you can post questions and there will be a Q&A session at the end of all the presentations. As many questions as possible will be answered, and those that can't be due to time constraints will be answered after the webinar via email. Shortly after this panel concludes, you will receive a link to a short survey. If you could take a few minutes to provide some feedback, we can improve on our future webinars, and it would be greatly appreciated. So first up, we have Stephanie Ray. Stephanie, if you could join us on camera. Hello.
Hi there.
So Stephanie is Managing Director of RSK Wilding at RSK. With 25 years of experience, Steph is a respected leader in the movement for rewilding and works at the vital intersection of business and environmental welfare. She's the former president of the Chartered Institute of Ecology and continues to advise the government on environmental issues. Stephanie, very excited that you're kicking us off, and I will leave you to it.
Thanks very much, Lucy. Just going to try and see if I can, there we go. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about what rewilding is and how we might manage to adapt that into an urban context. So the term itself is sometimes problematic and there's a rather polarized conversation around it. On the one hand, it's seen as the new and sometimes only acceptable approach to conservation management. And on the other hand, it's some kind of dangerous radicalism that involves releasing wolves all over the countryside and is the enemy of the rural economy. Now, at its simplest, it doesn't need to be anything like so polarizing. It's simply a move away from a very anthropocentric approach to conservation, where we decide what the outcomes should be, towards letting nature take the lead and a focus more on the processes and of restoring natural ecosystems rather than focusing on the outcomes. So I liken it to, if I want to create a wildflower meadow in my garden, I can do that quite easily. But if I chuck down some seed and I tinker with it and I weed it and I water it and I fill in any gaps, have I really created a wildflower meadow? Arguably, no, I haven't. I've created something that looks a lot like a wildflower meadow, a picture of an ecosystem, if you like, but I haven't created the soil chemistry. I haven't created necessarily the soil microbiota. I haven't got a whole community of animals that are supported by that. So what we're trying to establish is, well, how far can we go into actual rewilding, actually into the repair of ecosystems in our cities? So what makes for a successful rewilding project then? The Lawton Review about 10 years ago told us that when we needed to make space for nature, we needed spaces that were bigger, better and more joined up. And so scale is first of all one of the biggest issues in an urban setting. Obviously, the more space we have, the more likelihood it is that we can have these natural processes of colonization and succession and predator-prey relationships building up into food webs. It's much easier to get all of those things going and having an ecosystem that functions naturally if you're doing it at a larger scale. You need continuity. If you have smaller patches of habitat, then you can get an island effect. So the population doesn't get any genetic exchange with surrounding populations, and it can falter in that way. So connectivity between patches of habitat is important. We also need that kind of temporal connectivity. It takes time for habitats to re-establish. It takes time for ecosystem processes to be restored, often decades. So we need to know that we've got land that's secured in the long term to do that. Now, until we start in our economic system to actually account for natural capital better than we do at the moment, it's quite a big commitment in financial terms to tie land up in rewilding, and what we're likely to be focused on quite a lot of the time, rather than the very real and valuable natural capital benefits that are coming from that, is the opportunity cost of what we might otherwise have done with that land. So it's really important that we bring stakeholders with us on that journey. And then finally, we need an absence of negative impacts in the same way that you wouldn't do a large bird reintroduction next door to a wind farm. Then you're probably not going to look for a rewilding site that's surrounded and boxed in by development of a nature that has significant impacts on that site. I'm not saying don't do green spaces next to development, quite the reverse. I'm saying that it's a pressure on getting rewilding to be successful. So how can we achieve it then, this vision of bigger, better and wilder in an urban context? Well, if you're working up from the ground up from those ecological principles, we need to understand what's the minimum scale at which natural processes can operate. If I'm looking at the wildflowers in my front garden that have rewilded themselves, well, you know, they're starting the basic process of creating plants from sunlight. But if I wanted to support a decent population of the invertebrates that feed on those, I probably need to give up my whole veg patch to it. If we want to support some of the animals that eat those invertebrates, we've maybe got to talk about a whole garden. And if we want predators that are keeping those herbivores in control, we're looking at several square kilometres. And you need to work from what it is that you need to have functioning on that ecosystem. So you're going to need a lot more land if you want to create intertidal mudflats than if you want to plant a beechwood. There's also an ongoing debate really within ecology around whether it's better to protect one large habitat area or several small ones. There's obviously pluses and minuses for both of those approaches. If you have lots of small patches of habitat, well, that can get you as nice stepping stones across the landscape. They can help mitigate some issues of connectivity, but they have more edge, and the more edge you've got for the size of the area you've got, then the more vulnerable perhaps they are to impacts from the outside of areas that are not rewilded. Of course, similarly, if you have a single large site, then it's vulnerable to a catastrophic incident like a forest fire, for example. And does it matter what's between the habitat patches? Well, yes, as I've said, it matters whether there's development or other pollution pressures perhaps that are impacting it, but we're not going to be able to, in our cities, we're not going to rewild Oxford Street, we're not going to be able to take huge tracts of land often in an urban context. So it's really important that we have a patchwork pattern, and so we're trying to recreate the processes and the effect on the ecosystem of a large tract of habitat, doing it in lots of discrete patches. So yes, it matters what's between them, and the more patches, the closer together we have, then the better. Oh, I don't think that's what I wanted to do at all. Nope. Hopefully we're now back to our presentation. There we go. So what works well in rewilding in an urban context? I would go back a slide if I could. There we go. What works well? So ideally for me, river-based schemes are great. Working at a catchment scale gives you that scope and scale to do some really great things for habitat restoration and for rewilding. There's an example at the moment near to where I'm from, Stockton-on-Tees, is looking at knocking down its shopping centre in the middle of town and opening up the town back to the river and rewilding along that stretch. And that's a town that was heavily affected by pollution from the chemical and steel industries, now seeing otters and salmon back in its river. Other linear infrastructure can also work really well. So working with road corridors, rail corridors, again, so you're working with that connectivity. One of the best things about working in cities is that you can get so much community involvement, both in the planning, the actual implementation, and the monitoring for many years to come of what the benefits have been. And speaking of benefits, one of the things that's really important, I think, on rewilding sites in cities is maximising those other benefits, those benefits to communities from the ecosystem restoration. So things like just well-being, access to nature, education, mitigating local air pollution issues, and contributing to flood management. So there's a huge amount that can be done. I'd say that arguably some of the things that we're looking at are not necessarily rewilding. Some of the things are habitat creation. There's nothing wrong with that. Some of the things are focused on education or recreation or biodiversity net gain. Nothing wrong with all of those things. But if we put our sort of rewilding lens on it, then I think it's really helpful, because by restoring ecosystems that function naturally, we're going to be delivering so many more of the co-benefits. Thanks, Lucy.
Thank you so much for getting us off to such a strong start. That's fascinating to hear what might be happening in your hometown. Hopefully that goes ahead. I'd love to know whether you think rewilding is the right term for this sort of conservation in cities.
Yeah, I think it's a relevant term, and it's quite an engaging term that gets people thinking about what it is that we're trying to do. In classical ecological theory, I'd say what we're doing is probably not often rewilding. We're not often getting all of those ecological processes restored at scale. But I think trying to make it work at scale and using rewilding as a concept to make braver, bolder decisions about what we can do in our cities, like rewilding along river corridors, is a great approach to take.
Mm-hmm. And given these polarized opinions on species like urban foxes, do you think there is scope for species reintroductions into cities?
I do, yes. I think there's a big fear about reintroductions, both from the general public and also from scientists to some extent. Partly that's based on this view that it's all about wolves and bears and introducing top predators. In reality, most of the reintroductions we're going to do are plants, invertebrates, building up those building blocks of the ecosystems from the ground up. And when we do get to larger species, things like beaver, then we're doing things that, because they replace important ecosystem processes that are missing. Yeah, so I'm a huge advocate of rewilding, but I would take a cautious approach to species reintroductions. We need to understand the pressures on the release sites in the first place. We need to understand the disease profile of animals that we're releasing. But mainly, if we've lost a species from a habitat, we've lost it for a reason. We need to understand why that species went extinct in the first place and make sure those pressures are gone, whether they're hunting or pesticides or whatever they might be.
Mm-hmm. Definitely lots of work to be done, but thank you so much for starting us off, and we will see you again later at the Q&A. Next up we have Sabine. Sabine, if you could join us. Hello.
Hello. Hi, Lucy.
So Sabine Hoefnagel is a member of the supervisory board at Rewilding Europe, and she brings over 25 years worth of experience in sustainability consulting to her role as a member of the supervisory board at Rewilding Europe, as well as her role as Global Director of Services, Brand and Communications at ERM, a global sustainability consultancy. Can't wait to hear what you've got to tell us today. I'm going to disappear.
Thank you. Let me just get control. Yes, it's working. Oh, hold on. Going a bit too fast. Hi, everyone. I'm really pleased to be on this panel today on a subject that is so exciting and frankly really uplifting. I mean, for me, rewilding is a very inspirational and impactful approach to conservation. Having focused on sustainability throughout my career, I believe that the key problems that we are facing today as a world are climate change, nature loss, and social inequity. And rewilding, with its focus on nature restoration, carbon capture, and addressing social and community issues, provides a really holistic way to deal with these issues. So the appeal is very strong for me. I'm going to be providing a perspective on rewilding in Europe, which I've gained through my role in the organization called Rewilding Europe, but it's mostly focused on rural rewilding because that's what the organization is focused on. But I think there are many parallel efforts with rewilding in urban settings. So firstly, maybe some context about what's happening to rural areas in Europe. We're seeing a huge depopulation to the extent that we now have 4 out of 5 Europeans living in urban areas. And that's mostly because younger people often struggle to find livelihoods in rural areas. They might also be drawn by better education, better healthcare, better social life in cities. And the socioeconomic impacts of that are really enormous. It leads to loss of cultural heritage, a loss of connection to nature and land, and then increasingly limited employment opportunities. But there are also environmental impacts. The kind of open and diverse habitat biodiversity is being lost because of bush and forest encroachment, which is then resulting in a rapid decline of biodiversity and natural ecosystems. Combined with unsustainable agricultural practices, further ecosystem fragmentation, and amplified by global warming, this is leading to a very widespread land degradation across European landscapes. The EU biodiversity strategy to 2030 is actually estimating that up to 80% of European biodiversity is in a really poor condition, and that if you're looking at the rivers, only 30% of those can be regarded as living or healthy. And although there is the Natura 2000 network, which is seeking to protect the most valuable species and habitats, that covers about 18% of the land cover in Europe, but only about 13% of that are actually wilder areas. And although the designation of these sites are complete, the management and the enforcement and also the financial kind of the financing of these areas is still lacking. But there was also some positives. As a result of factors such as increased legal protection, reintroduction, the creation of corridors, and also the promotion of coexistence, we've actually seen wildlife and particularly larger animals such as elk, beavers, we're going to be talking more about those, white-tailed eagles and wolves making a comeback across Europe over the last 5 decades. But I would say that only really represents the start of what is possible and really what is needed, because rewilding can really create favorable conditions for spontaneous comeback of lots of wildlife species. And that can be done through reducing hunting quotas or creating hunting-free areas, combating poisoning or poaching, mitigating conflict and damage, and protecting nesting and breeding sites. So the goal of rewilding is really to develop and support these kind of coexisting models where people can also benefit from wildlife comeback. And really it is all about growing the acceptance of wildlife returning. You see these 2 pictures here where, in Berlin, you might run into some wild boar, or, the foxes in London that have been mentioned. They occasionally turn my own garden into a fox's disco. So really it is against this backdrop that rewilding is becoming more prominent and popular in Europe, and is providing an inspirational new conservation approach that is maybe stepping away a little bit from some of the doom and gloom narratives. And we can give nature a helping hand by creating the right conditions, whether that is by removing dikes or dams to free up rivers, by reducing active management of wildlife population, by allowing natural forest regeneration, and also reintroduction of species that have disappeared. And obviously when nature is healthy, we are healthier too. As people, we really rely on the natural world for water, food, and air. And there is lots of realization and research that really connects the the spending time in wild nature with both mental and physical health. There was actually a very interesting study done in Denmark a couple of years ago that shows that high levels of green space during childhood are associated with lower risk of a wide spectrum of psychiatric disorders in later life. Now, a little bit more about Rewilding Europe as an organization. It started 10 years ago with 5 areas. We now have 9 flagship areas covering about 2.3 million hectares. And within those, there is about 100,000 hectares currently, for which there are specific rewilding measures in place across wetlands, grasslands, and forests. And new kind of models are being introduced in a range of areas in these 9 areas. Now, the organization has 5 areas of work. I've already talked a bit about wilder nature and wildlife comeback, so let me just touch upon the other 3. So with regards to nature-based economies, we really want to show that rewilding can generate new business opportunities and jobs and income. And since 2013, we have supported through the Rewilding Europe Capital Fund 24 enterprises and disbursed about 2.3 million euros in 6 countries in loans. And those enterprises vary between wildlife viewing hides in Italy, sustainable hunting ventures in Croatia, a rewilding of forests, and a nature tourist camp in Portugal. With regards to interest in the wild, communication is extremely important. So there's a lot of attention to this in the organization through publications and films and engagement activities, social media, exhibitions, etc. And then last, magnification or amplification. Rewilding Europe is currently working on its strategy for the next 10 years, and scale up is really what that's all about. So that is very much about collaboration with other organizations, and there is a European rewilding network that was set up, and that now has 72 members in 27 countries across the continent, covering about 5 million hectares in total. Also this year in 2021, the Wild Foundation set up a global rewilding alliance, and Rewilding Europe has a really active role within that. But collaboration with academia and also more and more connecting with the private sector and financial markets is becoming important, especially as we are starting to explore the potential for nature-based carbon credits, or maybe what might be called rewilding credits in the future. Thank you, Lucy. That was all that I wanted to present.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. I would love to know what you think some of the key challenges are for rewilding in Europe.
Yeah, there are many, but I'd first like to call out the Common Agricultural Policy and the Forest Policy and the incentives that these bring. And I think Steph will already refer to this. It's very hard for rewilding to compete with those financial incentives, and therefore getting access to land is really difficult. The money that the average European farmer can make with subsidized farming is about 4-fold of what you could make out of rewilding. And then the second challenge, which is sort of linked to this, is that there is still no real financial value that has been put on nature. There isn't really a product or a value proposition that is investable at the moment. Now, we have high hopes that something along the lines of developing of rewilding credits is going to change that, but it's still very early days. And then last, I'd like to mention people. I think change is very hard for many people, and I think people have often developed what we could call an ecological blindness, where they believe that the way that nature looks, the way it looks now around them, is what it is supposed to look like. So, for example, in Scotland, there's actually very little biodiversity, but people accept the landscape the way it is. Or, for example, when wild horses were reintroduced in Denmark, people were really upset because they thought they looked really skinny, but that's actually the way that they're supposed to look. And I think bringing people along is really, really important, and it takes time. There was actually an article in The Guardian, I think about 10 days ago, that was really about rewilding is more about people, not about trees, or something along those lines. And as Frans Schepers, who's the managing director of Rewilding Europe, often says, rewilding is about 10% ecology and 90% psychology.
Definitely needs to have people on board to actually make an impact. I know there are 9 areas that Rewilding Europe works with. I was wondering if you could speak a bit more about some of the geographical differences with regards to rewilding that you're encountering.
Yeah, I mean, the areas are very different and things therefore play out very differently. And one example maybe to mention is deer in Scotland versus deer in Croatia. So in Scotland, we see far too many deer and also sheep actually, which has led to kind of severe depletion of trees due to overgrazing, but also logging. So therefore, we see very little diversity. And one of the solutions there really is about seriously bringing down the deer numbers, and ideally over time maybe reintroduce the lynx and maybe even wolves at some point, because there aren't really any other predators apart from humans at the moment. And we're seeing in the estates where Rewilding Europe is now present in the Afric Highlands, that where they are practicing deer management, that really is starting to pay off. But in Croatia, we have a very different situation where there is far too little deer due to overhunting. And there are predators there like wolves who have started attacking livestock. So the population is really not so happy about that. So that creates a lot of resentment, and the solutions there are really different. It's probably more about having less hunting, and Rewilding Europe has bought some concessions to sort of start changing that pattern, and also restocking deer. Another example maybe is how land ownership is so different in different countries. So for example, in the Apennines in Italy and in Portugal, we see lots and lots of tiny landowners, maybe like 1 hectare per landowner. If you contrast that with Scotland or Sweden, you see very, very large private ownership or forest corporations with maybe 20,000 hectares per owner. So that requires a very different approach for the local rewilding organizations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think especially with wolves, it's happening over here in the US where I'm based. So, there's a lot of different states that are reintroducing them, and they just don't seem to have gotten the management quite right yet. So it'll be interesting to see if Europe can learn from that. But thank you so much for your talk and for all your insights. And we'll see you again at the end for the group Q&A. I encourage everyone to keep sending your questions in to us. We're getting some amazing ones so far. So next up we have Elliot, who I believe his camera still isn't working, so he will be a voice but no face. Elliot, are you have you got your microphone?
Here. Can
Wonderful.
you hear me okay?
Yes,
Brilliant.
yes, I can. So Elliot McCandless is communications manager at the Beaver Trust, and he leads the nonprofit's communications, helping engage and inform the public about coexisting with beavers and river restoration. Elliot is a financial professional by trade who has long had a passion for conservation and rewilding. He was a trustee of Scottish Wild Beaver Group for 3 years between 2017 and 2020, and is currently a trustee of Scotland, The Big Picture. I personally am fascinated about beavers making a comeback, so I will leave it to you and you can get going with your presentation.
Thanks, Lucy. Hopefully I meet your expectations. So thank you. Just want to say thank you very much for having me, first of all. And sorry about the technical issues that you can't see me, but hopefully that doesn't make too much of an impact. So I'm just going to try, make sure I've got access. Give me a second, I should do. See if I can go to the next slide. There we go. So yeah, today I'm really here to talk about beavers being back in Britain. And I'm really here to pose a question about, could beavers be part of our urban landscape again or not? And I'm here to focus about beavers rather than rewilding as a whole, because beavers are really the mascot of rewilding in Britain, or they're really turning out to be recently. And they're a keystone species. They have a disproportionate impact on the areas that they live in and the species around them. And they can really help us, build climate resilient landscapes and tackle the freshwater biodiversity crisis if we learn to basically, live alongside them and work with them rather than against them. So I'm experiencing a bit of a delay. Sorry, I'll just see if this works. There we go. So just about beavers overall, they are a native mammal with a long evolutionary history. They've been in our rivers for a long time, alongside our riparian habitats and with other species that live there. And they're a bit of a conservation success story. So you can hopefully you can see at the bottom, Halley et al. 2020. So on the left, at the turn of the 19th century, you can just about make out that beavers are basically extinct in Britain, and they're almost extinct as Europe across the board. And then if we cut to the modern day on the right-hand side, you can see that through practical restoration efforts through a number of individuals across many countries, that we've really brought this species back. And I think the thing to say is that Britain is one of the last areas where we're bringing these animals back. Sweden reintroduced them in the 1930s, Germany in the 1960s, Norway in the 1960s. And it wasn't really until early 2000s in Britain that there was a more of a growing movement to see them restored. And that led to the first wild trial being taken place in Knapdale on the west coast of Scotland in 2009. And they eventually got protected European status in Scotland in May 2019. England and Wales are a bit different. They're still not recognised as a European protected species yet. There is multiple enclosed projects and there are wild populations living there. And currently England is having a consultation about wild releases. And I encourage you all, if you're based in England, to go onto DEFRA's website and take part of that. It's vitally important to shape the management of beavers going forward. So please go on to and take part. So beavers in urban setting. So beavers are not a species of wilderness. They're not an animal that lives in the wilderness. They're highly adaptive. They prefer big, wide, deep, fast-flowing rivers with lots of food. That's their prime territory. But as those territories get taken up, they will become adaptive and they will move into tributaries. They will move into headwaters, and they'll colonize urban areas in time. As you can see here, here's two examples of beavers in a drainage ditch in an agricultural landscape, and beavers in a back garden. And what will really kind of depend on their success in there is the food resources and our disturbance, but also kind of our attitude as a whole. So typically the attitude to having beavers in an urban area is an authority would come in and take them away and probably lethally control them, but that obviously doesn't have to be the case. And as we are, recognizing how beneficial beavers are, there's over 2,000 pieces of research across Europe which show that they can really help us tackle the climate and biodiversity emergencies. So it's obviously, if we can change that attitude, they can help us in that area. Also, urban areas, as we were as been touched on already, is a lot more people are living in cities and in urban areas, and that's a primary place where people interact with wildlife. So if we want people to care about beavers or care about wildlife or care about river restoration, they need to be able to interact with it. They need to be able to kind of see it and hear it and learn about it. So having animals like beavers in these places and learning the ecological processes they bring is a vitally important part. And I've got here Martinez Beaver. So this is an American example, but it's in California. It's a city where a family of beavers moved right in the center. You could walk over the little footbridge and watch them. And the local authority was going to basically trap them to lethally control them. And the community got together, went to local meeting and voted to basically keep them there. And not only do they do that, they have an annual festival every year to celebrate not just the beaver family that's there, but also, beavers as a whole and the benefits that they can have. Ultimately, coexistence is key. Beavers aren't problem-free. After humans, they are the only other animal that we know of that modify their environment to suit their own needs, which is quite unique. Now, obviously, in areas, that's going to provide challenges, especially in urban landscapes. You may find that, they may take down or ring bark, like eating the actual bark around a mature tree or an ornamental tree, which would cause it to die. But obviously dead wood's quite valuable as an ecological process. If they burrow into a bank that doesn't have, a buffer, a riparian or anything rooting it together, that might collapse. They'll fell trees and create a lot more woody debris in the river, and they'll obviously dam where the water depth is not good, big enough for them. They'll dam to increase that water depth to make it suitable. But this isn't new. Beavers have been around for generations across Europe and America, and the management tools exist to manage these animals. You can see two examples here. Top right, we have wire wrapping of a tree to protect it from beaver browsing, but you can also paint them with a mix of sand and exterior-based paint. At the bottom, you have a snapshot of a flow device, which is basically pipes going through a beaver dam, which keeps the water level behind the dam at a level that's suitable for both beavers, the land manager, or the community. So there are ways of working alongside beavers, basically. I just want to talk about, nationally, looking at this from not just about beavers, but at a bit bigger level, and really about making space for nature. Again, something that's already been touched on and will be touched on again, I'm sure. We have over 200,000 kilometres of waterways in Britain, and a lot of them are not in good environmental condition. And the reason for that mostly is the way we manage the areas around the rivers. So what we typically have is we farm up the edge, we build roads right on the edge. We're really encroaching on the river as a whole, and what we need to do is to make space. And when I talk about making space, this is what I'm kind of talking about here. We're talking about riparian buffers, basically vegetation along the edge of rivers like this. So as you can see, the clear example here, on the left we have it without a buffer, on the right we have with a buffer. On the right hand side it's much more natural. Buffers like this provide many ecological benefits. They reduce the amount of agricultural runoff into waterways. They slow the amount of water that's going down in there and reduce flooding downstream. They can provide connecting habitats between areas. Stephanie was talking about the connecting habitats. Buffers can act as that. But also, just to flag up about beavers, they can actually help minimize conflict. Gerhard Schwab, a leading beaver expert and a German beaver expert, has a great saying, which is if you give the river 10 meters of space either side, as in to allowing a buffer to establish, then you resolve 95% of beaver conflicts. And that's really, it's all about making space for nature. And just as another quick example of that, if it comes up, hopefully it does. Sorry, it's taken a second. Yeah, so here we go. So on the left, again, this is an example of where beavers have very little of a riparian buffer to work with, very little riparian vegetation. You can see the effects of a beaver being in there are profound, and they can sometimes be negative, and they're not always wanted by people. Whereas on the right, we have an actual naturalized buffer. I believe this is from Norway, and beavers have been there for decades. And you can barely see the impact, and the ecosystem as a whole benefits from not only the beaver's presence, but just benefits for wildlife, benefits as a whole, and we'll benefit as a species as well. We talked about the mental health benefits, the physical benefits of having green space. So we can bring this into urban areas. If we can create a bit more space for our rivers, we can obviously learn to live with beavers again, and we will benefit, and species as a whole will benefit. So just as a summary, beavers are back, and they will colonize urban areas as a matter of time. They're a keystone species that can help us tackle the climate and biodiversity crisis, but they will be a challenge, and we need to kind of work with them and better understand them as a species ourselves. And the best way to work with beavers is basically to provide buffers to make space for nature, and that would benefit not just beavers but many species and ourselves. And the last point is, please, if you're in England, the government consultation about beavers, about wild releases and beaver management is currently open on DEFRA's website, and it's open till November 17th. So please, please, please take 20 minutes out and go and complete that. So that's all from me. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you very much, Elliot. That was really great. Definitely lived up to my expectations.
It's good to hear.
I know there's also some fascinating research that's just come out about how beavers can act as mitigators for wildfires as well. So it's
yes, in America, Dr. Emily Fairfax is incredible.
It seems like the benefits they have for people can be endless. But I'd love to know, how soon you think we could see beavers back in our towns and cities.
Oh, well, they're already here. So I'm in Scotland. In Scotland, in Perth, we have beavers in there, and in Dunkeld, there are beavers right outside. You can go and have a pint in the local pub, and then go and watch them. So they're already here. And in England and Wales, it will just be a matter of time as well before they're actually in more cities and towns and stuff, living alongside us.
Mm-hmm. And what might some of the challenges be with rewilding beavers in urban settings?
Well, as I kind of touched on, these are animals which change the environment to suit themselves. So in areas you might see them come in and build a dam, which or block a road culvert, which can flood a road, or they might fell trees, which people might not want at the back of their gardens. But so there are challenges to having them, definitely, and but it's all about, are we prepared to give them space to be there? We have the tools to manage. As I said, you can paint the trees that you want to protect. You can put a culvert device in which allows beavers to go through the culvert without actually blocking it. You can do all these things. These tools exist. This knowledge exists. We just need to have a system, you know, a good management framework which allows us to implement them quickly and effectively to relieve people who are affected negatively quite rapidly. But gives, you know, beaver space. Basically, it's entirely possible. Like, beavers are in Munich, they're in Amsterdam, in America, they're in Vancouver. You know, like, as I say, we're behind the curve here. In Britain, generationally behind the curve. They're all across Europe. We just need to play catch up.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much, Elliot. You'll be
problem.
joining us again shortly. Next up, we have Dusty. Hi, Dusty. Is your microphone on?
Sorry, yes, it is on now.
There we go. There we go. So Dusty Gedge is president of the European Federation of Green Roof Associations. He has 25 years experience working in the green infrastructure sector, in which he is a recognized designer and technical and policy advisor on green roofing and urban infrastructure. His interest in biodiversity and urban nature has led his work in the built environment to focus on the promotion of greener cities through the adoption of green infrastructure projects. Sorry, can't talk. Projects. I look forward to hearing about those projects, and I will disappear.
Thank you. Hopefully my slides will move. There we go. Yes. So what I'm going to do is talk to you about some of those discrete places that Stephanie was referring to, but the discrete places that I'm involved with are actually unnatural spaces, and they're generally dictated by the construction industry. And also what I'm involved in is also about how cities adapt to climate change and wider environmental benefits. And a lot of nature conservationists can see green roofs as not important for biodiversity because they don't see it as meaningful, real biodiversity value habitat. But I'm going to try and say to you that we can do this, and I'm going to use the example of the linnet, which you can see there has declined over my lifetime. And by focusing on the linnet, we can also focus on wildflowers. Oh, slide's not working. Way back when, you saw the first slide there, I and a group of us invented this term brown roofs, which is about delivering green roofs for rare invertebrates. And the idea was to put crushed brick and concrete up there and let ecology come. It was actually a very, very bad idea from a roofing perspective because the ecology that came is very bad for the roofs and is not actually that interesting from rare invertebrates. So I started on the first original brown roof in Deptford in London, collecting seeds locally and spreading them. And this is actually the Bar Dance Centre about 2010, after about 10 years of spreading seeds. And it's actually created what is known as an open mosaic habitat. And this is all now covered in documentation that I've helped write, which is about how you design extensive green roofs for biodiversity. It's all about topography. It's all about seeding and planting native wildflowers. And by doing that, you get these very interesting invertebrate assemblages. And there's a picture of it. It's all about spiders, and it's about web spiders like the taller vegetation and the taller substrate and the barer substrate. You get the wolf spiders and the ambush spiders. And by doing that, you get a greater assemblage of invertebrates. Oops. But this is actually what the construction industry likes. The construction industry likes a product. And this is actually the default kind of green roof outside of London, across the United Kingdom and across a lot of countries in Europe. It's a product, it's a seed and blanket, and it's not actually really necessarily delivering for biodiversity in a real and meaningful way. But fortunately, hopefully, there's also another process which tries to meet that kind of aesthetic consideration that Stephanie was referring to. This is a kind of wildflower turf that is actually now being used on green roofs, but it takes a lot of water, and it's not actually really about producing robust vegetation that can survive our heat waves and our inundations, increased inundation, rainfall inundations. So I was very fortunate about 4 years ago to be given a clean slate on a very large retail green roof in Greenwich. And I was given bare substrate. This is a good green roof substrate. It's not quite a natural soil. It is a blended soil. And I was able to start seeding and bringing native vegetation to this roof. I've done it before on other roofs, but this is a good example. And an example of a habitat that actually relates to a green roof is like vegetated shingle, or this is actually a cockleshell beech in Kent. And I've collected seeds from here and I've deposited them on the roof. I also collect seeds from, and there you can see the seeds going in. And this is one of my boxes of seeds. I have about 7 boxes that are going to go onto that roof this year. I also collect from chalk grasslands. I collect from strange places between motorways and railway lines which have been seeded with native flora. And these are some of the places that I've collected seeds over the last 12 months. This is Blackheath, where I live, which is these natural wildflower banks along the roads. This is Soapbox Hill in Bromley. And hopefully Luddingstone comes up. That's Luddingstone Country Park. And this is Samphire Hoe, which in fact is actually man-made itself, because this is made from all the chalk that came from underneath the Channel Tunnel diggings. So by doing that, I've managed to spread these seeds over the last, this is also sea salter, which is also a cockleshell beech. These are natural environments. This is Dungeness, which is vegetated shingle too. And these are natural environments in the wider community. And this is now this retail roof. It was taken this May, and within 2 years, it should be fully vegetated. And it's replicating many of the circumstances of those habitats that these seeds have come from. And also, where this is being built on North Greenwich was a massive, great big brownfield site, and it's actually been colonised by a lot of very interesting vertebrates associated with those brownfield sites. I just wanted to pretty put that one back in. Hopefully I can go back. Well, you saw a picture of a green roof with some solar panels. This is another thing that's a very, very important thing in cities about generating renewable energy. But when you do them with green roofs and you do them well, you can actually create these very interesting wildflower spaces. And on this roof, small blue butterfly colonized 2 years ago, and it's got a very, very large colony. And I suspect there's colonies all over London where kidney vetch is present. And there's the linnet. And the linnet is now feeding on that retail roof. It's been feeding all summer. And originally, I did a bird survey back in 2000 of the Greenwich Peninsula, and there was between about 7 and 10 pairs of linnets. And I estimate, hopefully if we go forward, that over the years, you can see all those yellow circles. They're all roofs which have good, they're all housing developments have really good green roofs. And actually, the linnet population on the North Peninsula over the last 20 years has increased, primarily because we've rewilded the roofs, and most of those roofs use some kind of native flora. And I think that should be my end. Thank you.
That was wonderful. I'm impressed how quickly you got through all of those. 1
minute over.
I'm really fascinated by rural and coastal habitats on roofs. Are these appropriate in cities from a rewilding perspective?
Well, they are in terms of roofs, because roofs are actually a very stressed environment. They're a dry grassland. And in the UK, things like vegetated shingle, cockleshell beeches, or the tops of chalk grassland are very, very similar to the kind of conditions that you're going to get a green roof. In the green roof industry, we generally refer to them as short grass prairie if you're in the United States of America, like you are, Lucy. So they're stressed environments, the Gobi steppes. So, you know, they are appropriate.
Mm-hmm. That's really, really interesting to know. And you mentioned how the construction industry likes products and not ecological complexity. How do we change that?
Well, I think, you know, the point about the construction industry, it's actually cities. Cities like things to be very preordained and organised. And rewilding cities at ground level or even at roof level, we need to change the perspective and the aesthetic of what actually delivers a full range of ecosystem services. And one of those ecosystem services is actually biodiversity, and meaningful biodiversity.
That makes sense. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to get you to stay on. Now it's time for our group Q&A. So if everyone else can join us, that would be fantastic. And we've had a lot of questions through, so I'm going to try and get through as many as we can. Just to check, Elliot, can we hear you?
Yeah, I'm here.
Wonderful. Okay, great. So one of the first questions is designating new green spaces is often resisted due to management costs incurred by the local council. To what extent can a rewilding mindset help local councils to reduce the management costs of their green spaces? Is there anyone who'd like to tackle that first? Yes, Dusty.
It's just that actually I know that Blackheath, where I live, I showed you one picture of the wildflower meadows, is actually, they don't mow it as much these days, and they let a lot of the grass areas go long. It actually saves Lewisham Council quite a lot of money, which they can put back into other services or actually managing their own nature reserves. So, you know, the idea of always short grass in cities is we should move away from that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Is there anything else anyone wanted to add? If not, we'll move to the next.
Well, I agree with Dusty really around the principles of sustainability being about doing more with less, intervening less. And so, yes, there is an opportunity to cut your bills down. But the problem is, if you let grass get long, then you need to cut it eventually. If you haven't got wild herbivores eating it, you need to cut it eventually, and then you sometimes do end up with a big disposal problem at the end of a growing season. So it's really good if we can get that sort of circular economy thinking going, so that we've got an end use for it. We can cut it and bale it and use it for hay. We can do something productive with that offtake.
Mm-hmm. And this is an interesting one. Is there any research about the impact rewilding could have in roadkill numbers? I witnessed a daily massacre near where I live. I wonder if an increase in roadkill, specifically large animals, would not drive public opinion away from rewilding. Sabine, perhaps you could try and tackle that one first.
Sorry, Lucy, can you, so it was about whether rewilding can reduce roadkill?
No, whether it would have an increase in roadkill numbers and whether that increase could impact public opinion.
Well, I mean, honestly, I don't know. But what I would say is that any rewilding initiative tends to really spike kind of public opinion, and there's always lots of people for and against. So I can imagine that this would be one of these topics that would be really brought out in these public debates, and it would be really, you know, again stresses the importance of stakeholder engagement. But I don't have you know, figures about you know, about whether there would be increased roadkill.
Elliot, what about? Oh, sorry, Dustin. Perhaps we could go to Elliot and then I'll bring it back over to you.
Yeah, sure. I was just going to talk about, again, it comes down to this idea of planning. And, you know, in the Netherlands, they have green bridges. So where you have all about connecting habitats. So in terms of like building motorways, building infrastructure, if we make more space for nature in our planning and build more green bridges, we would see less roadkill and more connection of vital habitats between areas. So I think, again, it's this thing of, you know, rewilding shouldn't be an approach in itself. It should kind of affect kind of every area of how we approach everything. So whether it's building infrastructure, whether in cities or in roads. Sorry.
It's not, if I may, because I was involved in something where how I met Stephanie actually, and it was down in the New Forest on deer, and having links in the New Forest would reduce deer numbers and would reduce deer kill on the road would be logic. And deer accidents are quite damaging potentially to people. And so you would see that introduction of links could actually reduce that.
And to that point, what we often see, because people think, okay, you introduce predators and that means we'll just have a lot more killing of deer. But actually what it often does is that it changes the behavior of deer. So they will be spending more time in the forest and not out on grazing land or on roads. So that's actually a much more impactful effect of reintroducing predators than actually the, you know, additional killing of deer.
Mm-hmm. And this actually ties in quite nicely with the next question. I work for a high density housing developer. Are there any good examples of how rewilding sites harmoniously with the build environment? So I guess, yeah, if anyone has any interesting case studies that they could share, that would be really great, particularly in these high density housing environments.
I would always say green roofs on high density, because that's what I do. But actually, it is a way. But on that is something, if I may, because it wasn't time to get it in mind. I think there's also an opportunity for people to have access to the type of roofs that I'm interested in, so that they can actually engage with nature, and that gives value to those high density developments.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree, Dusty. I think there's got to be a role for green roofs, green walls, as well as the little pocket parks, little areas where you can grow food, and it's a whole mixture of different green uses in a high density urban environment. And what we're seeking, yes, you're never going to make a whole natural, normally functioning ecosystem through high density housing, but what you can do is keep those little stepping stones and keep the species alive and able to move out to those wider habitat patches, and you're generating something that's of value to biodiversity and to the local population.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the next question we have is, what about green corridors or tunnels over and under roads? That's a really interesting one. Can any of you think of any examples where that's happened, or is there any kind of projects that are kind of planning that sort of thing? The person who asked the question said there was funding in Wales a few years ago, but I think that's stopped now. Can you also recommend anywhere that may fund small projects?
There's a famous, I think was the first is a dormouse bridge near Tunbridge Wells, which was built to facilitate the movement of dormice between two forested areas. But if you go to places like Alberta, I mean, they're really common in Alberta to let bear and elk and things move across the main road that runs from both sides, from Vancouver all the way to Halifax.
Yeah, there are some amazing both in North America and in Europe. I think, wildlife bridges is essentially a national sport in the Netherlands, isn't it, Sabine?
Yes, it is. I was just going to mention that. I went on a walk in the summer in a rewilded area, and the Netherlands is a tiny country, and there isn't actually that much land available. But there is some very successful rewilding alongside rivers, and then connections made with forests that might be separated from those rivers by big roads, but they have created tunnels or bridges, and you'd be surprised with how little space you actually need to create these bridges for wildlife to be able to to roam freely. So yes, it is a national sport, Steph.
Can I just say there's also an example in Aberdeen as well, in Scotland, where we built a new bypass around Aberdeen, and there was 2 wildlife bridges installed, and there was mammal-proof fencing put around to direct animals across these green bridges. Now, whether, again, it's a step in the right direction, but it's definitely being done and should be included in all constructions of that kind.
Yeah.
Definitely. Unfortunately, we actually don't have time for any more questions. I feel like that hour went incredibly quickly, but there are quite a lot of other questions, so we'll send them to the panelists afterwards. I hope you'll all agree that today's panel really provided some fascinating insights into rewilding urban areas. It definitely seems our first hurdle is accepting that we do need to live side by side with wildlife and recognizing that rewilding can bring great benefits to local communities. And it's definitely on us to demand better from local government and city planners, whether that's an integrated approach into urban development or wildlife credits, which would be great to see as well. Thank you everyone for joining, and a huge thanks again to our panelists. Please do fill out the feedback survey that will be sent to you about an hour from now. Our next topic in the Green Dialogue series is on the 4th of October. Oh no, sorry, not October, we're in October, 4th of November, Net Zero, the challenges facing our food chain. And for more details about that webinar and to book, please visit the RSK website, and the link is in the chat box. Thank you again to everyone, and I hope that all our audience members are going away with some nice takeaways from that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.